Welcome everyone to the British Academy. I'm delighted this evening to introduce a theologian, a poet and a priest who became Archbishop of Canterbury in 2002 and remained in post till 2012. He was also, until 2020, the Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge. Rowan Williams was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1990. He's the author of many books, including Passions of the Soul and Looking East in Winter. His next book, Solidarity, is due to be published, I think, in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, yes. He was made a life peer in 2013 and is now Lord Williams of Oystermouth. Welcome, Lord Williams. We're going to be discussing the books that made you and shaped your thought and response to the world, which I think is going to be a brilliant conversation. There will, of course, be time for questions from all of you a little bit later on. Let's begin at the beginning, because that's always a good idea. I'm assuming that you have always been a prodigious sort of reader and writer. Was that a habit that you developed when you were young?
Thank you, yes. I think it was because I was very sickly as a child. I had meningitis when I was 2 and seemed to spend a lot of time in bed. And that's quite a good start for reading. There's nothing much else to do.
So thinking about that time when you spent sitting in bed, I imagine, and reading, was there a book that you encountered in your childhood that really left an impression on you?
I thought a lot about this, and the one I finally settled on was Francis Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden, which I think I must have read when I was about 8 or 9. And I haven't reread for quite a long time, though I remember reading it to my children. And two things that really struck me about it and which probably had some impact, some lasting impact. One was that the first chapter is all about people dying of cholera.
Cheerful stuff.
Which is a great start for a children's book. And the heroine's mother, of course, dies of cholera in the first chapter, and you have this extraordinarily vivid description of this child of, about 10, left alone in a mouldering colonial mansion in India, with just 1 or 2 Indian servants hanging around. She doesn't know what to do, she doesn't know what's happening. She sees a snake slithering under the furniture, and it dawns on her that everybody's dead. And eventually somebody turns up and rescues her and sends her off to recuperate in Britain. So that's quite a startling beginning, and it haunted me. The first time I read it, I was really quite disturbed by it, I think. But it's quite important that we're honest about certain features of our humanity. And this first chapter, which both named mortality, and in a rather curious and indirect way also named inequalities of power and privilege. That stuck. Second thing is that it's unusual among children's books in having 2 utterly obnoxious children as the heroes. Mary and Colin are brats. They're spoiled, selfish, entitled brats. And somehow you have to find a way of identifying with them as a bit of a cliche, but getting inside how these 2 selfish, entitled, miserable children are to be opened up to something a bit like ordinary humanity. And how does it happen? It happens with the breakdown of one particular bit of social division in their befriending Dickon, the local Yorkshire lad, and it happens because of the natural world. And somehow grace, and I use the word advisedly, grace arrives in both of those contexts.
I have to confess, it was a book I adored as a child, and it was that possibility of transformation and the healing nature of the natural world. Was that something that was important to you then when you were growing up in Swansea?
Partly Swansea, partly Cardiff, but yes, in Swansea we lived by the sea for quite a few years, and the changing face of the sea and the Gower coastal path both mattered enormously to me as a child, as a teenager. And I think back to those distant days of being able, with friends from school, sort of 15, 16, just to disappear for a day onto the Gower or up onto Fairwood Common in the middle of the Gower Peninsula and discover and just feel.
To be in nature.
In the natural order.
It is always interesting to think about books that may have been really foundational to one's thinking. Obviously, as a child, you're not reading books in that way, but they leave an impression on you. When you think about your career as a whole and your life as a whole, is there a book then that you have returned to at different stages of your life?
I guess one of the books I've most consistently reread is slightly unusual choice maybe, but it's the Spiritual Letters of Abbot John Chapman. John Chapman was an English Benedictine monk who became Abbot of Downside in the 1920s, 30s. He was a very distinguished scholar of the early church. He wrote some formidable stuff about the different recensions of the Latin Vulgate, some work on New Testament scholarship. But he was also a spiritual director of very unusual stature and depth. And after he died in the 30s, a lot of his letters were collected, and they're just full of the most remarkable human and divine wisdom. He's writing to people who are asking about, and this is where perhaps there's a connection to other things I've done, he's often writing to people who are trying to make a connection between the life of prayer and the life of the mind. So famously, the longest letter in the book, which is about 36 pages, is a letter to a Jesuit, a young Jesuit who's beginning his theological studies and hating it. And he writes to Chapman to say, essentially, I'm bored out of my wits by theology, and it doesn't seem to connect remotely with anything that matters to me as a practicing believer, let alone a member of a religious order. And Chapman writes back this amazing letter in which he says, first of all, don't panic. We all have these
Wobbles.
rough patches. But then, more interestingly, says, actually what we're doing when we pray, particularly what we're doing when we try to pray in silence, when we attempt contemplation, makes sense against a broad picture of how God and the world interact. So let me just take a deep breath and show you something of the big picture. And he goes on to talk about what it means to believe in creation, which means effectively to believe in a sort of pervasive divine invitation and presence wherever you look, what it means to believe in the incarnation of the church, what it means to have a certain picture of how humanity works, in which there isn't a kind of lethal opposition between the divine and the human, but an instinctive quivering of the needle in the direction of God. And at the end of the letter he says, this is the longest letter I have ever written, and I hope I never do it again. But the point is that he's trying to spell out exactly how the connection might work, how you might understand your theology, if you've got to do it, in terms of what you're doing in both in silent prayer and contemplation and in active pastoral ministry. And I read that, I suppose, when I was about 21, 22, and I remember thinking then, as I've thought every time I've opened it since, yes.
Did you consider becoming a monk?
I did, yes, for quite a few years. I like to think some of it was positive, that I liked the idea of having time to pray, and I'm uncomfortably sure that quite a bit of it was negative, maybe wanting somebody else to do the cooking for me. But as time went on, yes, other things happened.
But in terms of this being a book that you return to over and over again, if you first read it in your 20s, do you feel your relationship to Chapman has changed over the years?
Yes, I suppose first time round you read, as with many books that you love, you read uncritically, don't you? You think, yes, this immediately registers, this is how it is. Then you come back and you think, yes, fine, but then maybe you come back and you think, and you know what? If I'm able now to question some of what's in this book, it's because the book has helped me question it. Because I've been given resources to go a bit deeper by the book, even if I don't now think it's absolutely inspired scripture. I come back with new resources. And then you come full circle and think, the old man was right about most things after all.
And there is a maxim from the book that I think lots of people may be familiar with, which is pray as you can, not as you can't. Is that something you relate to?
That's absolutely central, I think, to what Chapman's talking about, and I do relate to it, and I use it often when I'm trying to talk to people, individuals and groups about prayer, because I think what he's pushing back against in the letters again and again is a particular mindset which thinks there's a method that can be applied for everybody, and if you're not finding yourself at home with that, that's your fault, and so you better feel maximally guilty about it and go to confession a bit more often. And Chapman is consistently saying, look, don't even think about that. You, with your temperament, your history, your attrait, you are the person who's there. And that's the person God relates to, because that's the truth. And God doesn't do falsehood. So stick with that. Assume that you're in a relationship with God which doesn't depend on how you feel and how you think you're doing. Hang on in what may be darkness and may sometimes be light, but just assume that you are in the presence of healing and grace. And as he says very powerfully in another of his famous lines, sometimes you're held so close to the heart of God you can't see God's face. And that's certainly, to me, a very resonant image, which again I've used for myself and for others over the years.
So Chapman's a book that has provided you with spiritual sustenance, if I can call it that. In your career as a theologian, as a public figure, is there a book that you would recommend to someone who is new to this world, who is new to the world of spiritual thoughts and ideas?
I suppose two books or two writers come to mind. I had the great delight of knowing the late Elizabeth Templeton, wonderful Scots theologian. And apart from some of the early work she did on philosophy of religion, she brought together a collection of pieces not long before her very untimely death, called The Strangeness of God. And I would, I think, recommend anybody beginning theology to look at this, because it's what it says on the tin, really. It's a collection of quite quirky, unpredictable essays which look at theology from neither what I'd call a liberal nor a conservative point of view. She's a very idiosyncratic writer with hugely imaginative style, and just helps you see that theology can be a very, in the best possible sense, a very weird discipline. And its interest and value has something to do with being weird. It gives you resources for seeing things oddly. And I think that's a very educative thing. We were talking about the role of the humanities in education earlier on. And I think the humanities are all about helping people see things weirdly, to be honest. So,
well, far from wanting to describe you as weird, that wouldn't really be very polite, would it? But just to digress for a moment from the book, what was it that drew you then to studying theology? Were you a little bit weird?
Is this being recorded? I suppose I was, really. But in my mid-teens, I very much fell in love with language, with poetry, fiction, and perhaps rather untypically, I thought that was exactly what was going on when I went to church. That something was happening to the world of language, which was rather exhilarating and rather unpredictable, and yes, weird. And I wanted to find out more about that. So I did think for quite a while that I ought to be studying English rather than theology, because if you come to theology with that kind of aspiration and you then spend your first 6 months learning Hebrew and Greek, you think, is this actually what I signed up for? It was, and that was wonderful in the long run, but at first it was a bit odd. And then then it all sort of came together again. I thought, yes, of course, it is all about what I was learning, sensing, discovering in that literary world. And it made sense.
Thinking about Elizabeth Templeton, she was someone who really believed in dialogue, in discussing theology in a very public way, and she wanted it to be an open conversation. How do you think that point of view sits with the sort of more muscular Christian nationalism that we're seeing emerging, imported perhaps from the United States, and it's sort of finding its way here too?
How does it sit? I think it sits down and then gets up again rather quickly. And that is one of the problems, isn't it? We have an environment in which it's all too easy to weaponize religious discourse for one means or another. In other words, to make it rather less strange, because if you weaponize something, you own it. You know how to manipulate it, you know how to put it in the field and wind it up and watch it go. And part of what Elizabeth was always interested in was the way in which all sorts of apparently obvious binaries and all sorts of obvious schematic pictures were not exploded exactly, but just radically pushed around by exposure to the fundamental realities. Now, she wasn't a kind of relativist who thought, oh, all doctrinal language is up for grabs and you just work it out.
But it was about dialogue, wasn't it?
It was about dialogue, but dialogue within, I think, a framework of a certain basic grammar about how you approached God, which was meant not to close things down, but to open things up. Interesting that on the cover of the book, there's that extraordinary sketch that William Blake made of the Trinity. Now, pictures of the Trinity, good pictures of the Trinity, are rather rare for obvious reasons. But it's significant that Elizabeth wanted that on the cover. The doctrine of God as Trinity for a Christian is part of keeping it weird. It's part of saying the God we're dealing with is not a God you can, as it were, locate and walk around. You've somehow got to be in the middle of it.
So, bearing in your mind your idea that there is something slightly weird about theology, but we also live in an age where people are looking to use your word, to weaponize ideas, what advice would you have for someone who is thinking about studying theology now?
Basic advice is keep your mind open to what questions theology is trying to answer and why. Why did this ever matter? How did it come to matter? Watch how people learn. And having taught for many years the early history of Christian doctrine and the Christian church, I guess part of what I took from that was I'm watching people learning how to use language. And in that process, discovering a bit more about why and how these conclusions matter. As I sometimes used to say to students, people didn't engage in these theological controversies just because they hadn't yet invented jigsaws and crosswords. They cared about these things, sometimes for very mixed reasons. Sometimes it gets tangled up, as it always has been, with different kinds of politics, with the status of the imperial authority in Rome, with the power of bishops, all kinds of things like that. And having allowed for all that, you then say, yes, but there was something else going on which kept the conversation going, shall we say.
It's interesting, though, there are those who might say in a very secular society the ideas that come from theology have been sidelined, but at the same time you have this huge politicization of religion in not just Christianity, but in many quarters. Is that something that's hard to reconcile?
Well, it's hard to reconcile morally, you might say. It's also rather painfully predictable, given that the strangeness of God is quite hard work, and it's not what makes life easy for people. But I think I'd also say, yes, we like to think of ourselves as a secular society, but going back to this question of how we learned to think the way we think, then all kinds of aspects of our culture do have their roots in a particular kind of Christian discourse. And I think, above all here, of what we take sometimes lazily for granted about human rights. In the book on solidarity, which you kindly mentioned, I've got a section there, I've got a chapter there, on the debates about who counts as human that come up with surprising and disturbing regularity.
Yes.
Are women really human? Are non-white people really human? Are disabled people really human? And so on and so on. And at every stage of philosophical history, there have been apparently good reasons for saying that some categories of human beings count less than others. Now, Christian theology has frequently bought into versions of that, and then has been, as it were, yanked back to the central point by the yes, but if, as it says on the first page of Scripture, human beings are made in the image of God, we've got a bit of a conceptual problem if we want to degrade various varieties of human. So there's a theological afterglow in some of our political and social thinking, which you don't have to be a Christian to recognize that, but I think it's a kind of dangerous illiteracy not to see that it's a process by which we've come to this point of recognition. And to know that something is not self-evident is to know how important it is to learn how to defend it. You don't just go around saying, but isn't it obvious? And thinking, well, if you don't believe this, you must be very wicked or very stupid. You say, well, what is it that stops people learning and ingesting this vision of humanity?
Which brings us quite neatly onto another really important idea, that an idea that's very important to you. It is an important idea. The question of social justice, which is something you've written about and thought about a lot. What would you point to in terms of books that you've read that have informed your thinking?
Well, we're back to the 1960s again and my teenage years, and probably it would have to be turning up in the school library a copy of Trevor Huddleston's Naught for Your Comfort. That great testament to the beginnings of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Trevor Huddleston, who was an Anglican missionary, a member of an Anglican religious community, who spent a good few years in what's now Soweto and was then Sophiatown on the outskirts of Johannesburg, campaigning relentlessly and aggressively, in the best sense, for justice for the people of the townships. And that book, and I so well remember that cover picture, that book made me think that a lot of what I'd been rather unthinkingly taking for granted in the faith I was being raised in fact pressed you to some quite difficult decisions and side-taking. And Trevor Huddleston's book was about how being a rather old-fashioned Anglo-Catholic might press you to take a stand in certain circumstances against injustice. So that became, I think, a very important thing for me, and Trevor Huddleston himself a very important lodestone for all that his life in a good many aspects was complex and troubled, but there it was. And the fact that I spent a couple of years living with the monastic community at Mirfield and teaching in their college, Trevor's community, that to me mattered a lot as I was beginning my work as a teacher.
As a book, though, reading it, absorbing it, discussing it, did you feel that the society that you found yourself in, I don't know what I'm describing, but the world that you found yourself in, was it open to those ideas? It was, in a way, they were ideas that took a long time to become part of the mainstream, the anti-apartheid movement.
They did, but one of the things about the 60s, and looking around, I venture a guess that there are a few people who will remember the 60s here, was a bit of a sense that you were part of a tide that was flowing. Now, I hate the language of being on the right side of history. There is no such thing as the right side of history. History doesn't have sides, it doesn't do that. But there can be moments where you feel that currents of quite diverse perspectives on public issues and international issues are converging in subtle ways, or not so subtle ways, and things are possible that may not have been possible a few years before. And the beginnings of the anti-apartheid movement in Britain were, I think, among the most prominent things of that era. The campaign, for example, to take your account away from Barclays Bank and put it somewhere more ethically sound, that was something which as an undergraduate I was involved in. And yes, I think I'd just say that in a number of ways, the feeling that certain apparently fixed and given elements in society might shift for the good, that kind of hopefulness was a big part of growing up in that era, and not one that's available in quite the same way these days.
No, we'll come back to that. The other thing that I wanted to raise was, of course, the 1960s, the era perhaps when television came of age, and there was a very famous documentary, Cathy Come Home,
yes,
about homelessness. Now,
yes.
I think this is something that affected you too.
Profoundly. I remember watching it on its first showing, Cathy Come Home, and
it was actually a play. Sorry, I said it was a documentary. It was a play, wasn't it?
it was a play. And then being rather taken aback that my parents, who were quite conservative, couldn't really see the point of it, and tended to think, as so many did and do, that homelessness is really down to failure of some kind. But that kindled my sense of this as a really significant social issue, and when I first went up to Cambridge in 1968, I suppose prompted me to get involved where and how I could with various bits of work with homeless people. And
this is while you were an undergraduate?
I was an undergraduate. And I remember very vividly, I think it was my second night in Cambridge, walking back from something, just encountering a homeless man in the street and getting into conversation and spending the next hour or so walking the streets with him and just hearing about some of what was going on. And I think that was an important kind of, what should I say, setting, in the sense of, you adjust your settings for the next 3 years, that I was never able to think of Cambridge just as King's College Chapel.
Yes. I mean, it was an extraordinarily galvanising moment, because I think the charity crisis grew out of the reaction to that documentary, a turning point in people perhaps understanding what was beneath their noses.
Yes.
But do you think 50, 60 years later that we've actually become less sympathetic to the suffering of others?
Yes, we have. Yes. We tolerate levels of homelessness in this country which are scandalous.
But why?
We've not, I think, noticed over the years just what the social cost is of some of the disruptions, generations of unemployment, trauma for returning servicemen and women. But I remember back in the 60s and 70s, quite a lot of the homeless people I got to know were ex-service on the streets because there was nothing for them when they came back from the forces or had been in difficult and traumatic situations. We've not factored in the cost of that so often, and with a general loosening of social bonds and social recognition and empathy, we've just got used to something which we ought not to be used to. I really, really give thanks for the existence of The Big Issue.
Yes.
Not only a good magazine in itself, but also one that doesn't simply make homelessness visible, but makes visible the granular facts of how people cope with it, how they react to it, and weave that in with general discussion of the kind of society we are.
But thinking more broadly beyond homelessness and more generally to having concern about wider society, you and I were talking just before we came on about that moment at the beginning of the pandemic when we all thought that we would look after our neighbours and we tried to help one another. And yet it does feel like an awfully long time ago. Why were we not able to somehow capture that spirit? I would argue it evaporated very quickly.
Very quickly. Perhaps it is simply that it's hard work. But of course it was extra hard work in that it wasn't simply that a pandemic came and went. It was that during that period, other things were going on, further destabilizing a world that was already dangerously frightened. Frightened of pandemic, frightened to the point of paralysis about environmental crisis and in denial about it. Then, as barely were we out of the worst of it when the Ukraine war began. It's not a good time for pondering solidarity and unselfishness, but it's interesting that in that period, as in the financial crisis of 2008, one of the first things people register and talk about is, we have to have a reset. Remember in 2008, people said, the international banking system can't survive this. Well, the international banking system seems remarkably resilient. Similarly, in the pandemic, we said, now we really know the value of the work of basic carers and nurses and all the rest of it. Now we really know that we over-reward some people for jobs that maybe don't deserve quite such rewards. And again, mysteriously, out of focus it goes again.
Interesting.
Somebody ought to write a book, I think, I shan't, but a book about the typology of crises, This is the rhythm of it, this is the pattern of it.
There you go, there's an idea to take home. You're someone who thinks profoundly, you write, but you also are a poet, and you've written a lot about the power of poetry. So is there a collection or a poem that you yourself turn to?
The collection would have to be Auden's collected poems, W.H. Auden's collected poems. I think I must have bought that when it first appeared in the mid to late 70s. I'd read a bit of Auden before and appreciated it, and knew I needed to read more. And what it did for me as a poet, I suppose, was to wean me off a certain kind of laziness in writing. You start, generalizing, but my experience anyway, you start writing poetry as a young person, as a teenager or a student, and an awful lot of it is absolute rubbish and very self-indulgent and very easy. Then somebody like Auden comes along and says, if you're going to do this seriously, you need to look at your tools better. Look at your words more closely. What are you doing with these words? You're not just expressing your feelings. You are making a pattern in words and sound that will communicate. And I thought, right, yes. Put my hand up, convicted. So I started writing a bit differently, trying to pay a bit more attention to word and sound, admiring, as I still admire, Auden's amazing technical facility. I don't think he's the greatest poet of the 20th century, but I think he's the one I go back to be reminded of craft in the very best sense. So that had a big impact. I could also say that in the later 70s, early 80s maybe, I began to read Geoffrey Hill, who had the same kind of impact for me. And yes, I think I can tell the story. I was really, really delighted when, many years later, I read a review of one of Geoffrey Hill's new collections by a poet and critic, I better leave nameless, who at one point quoted a line of Hill and said, this might be Les Murray, or worse still, Rowan Williams. And I was delighted to be thought only a little bit worse than Geoffrey Hill. So, yeah. And the poem, I suppose, which I go back to most often in all sorts of contexts, would have to be George Herbert's Love. Love Bade Me Welcome. I read it as a 16-year-old when we were doing the metaphysical poets for A-level. I remember being very struck by the fact that the great and complicated Simone Weil was reciting that poem as she felt something taking hold of her on her retreat at the Benedictine Abbey at Solesmes. It's one that I naturally want to quote and repeat, as I say, in all kinds of contexts.
So is it these poets, these poems that you think about when you're writing? How does it all influence you as a poet yourself? You've talked about the craft, I suppose. And
another little anecdote, which is R.S. Thomas, that great and craggy Welsh figure, doing a reading and afterwards being asked by somebody in the audience, could you tell us about your influences? And R.S. gazed out of the window, looking uncompromising, as he always did. There was a long silence. And eventually the chair said, don't know if you heard that, Mr. Thomas, but there was somebody in the audience asking about your influences. And there's another long pause, and Thomas swung his head round and said, surely not. Nobody really likes talking about their influence. But you don't, I think... Well, start again. You don't imitate unless you know that's exactly what you're doing. Trying to write, as it were, in your own name, an Auden poem or a Geoffrey Hill poem is a recipe for disaster. You have to find your own voice. But the odd and interesting thing about writing poetry is that sometimes it's quite a good idea to try and write an Auden poem or a Geoffrey Hill poem or even a George Herbert poem to flex the muscles, to get something flowing, and to polish some of the skills in writing that you're going to need. And that's part of the way in which writing poetry is always strangely conversational. You know, you're not just monologuing onto the page. You are, in a very important sense, trying to, what should I say? Trying to catch the ball that a poem throws to you and find the direction in which you want to throw it back.
You've also translated poetry from Welsh, which I find really intriguing, that translation from one language to another, capturing meanings and cadence and rhythms. What are the challenges involved?
The hardest thing in translating from Welsh is that classical Welsh poetry has a mercilessly complicated rhyme scheme.
Right.
And putting that into English without sounding artificial is quite hard work.
I confess to knowing nothing about classical Welsh poetry.
Don't get me started. We're here all night. But the challenge I find in translating from other languages, not just Welsh, is finding a balance between a faithful translation of the words of the poem and a faithful translation of the poem. The poem is a whole pattern. You know, it's a whole story. It's not just a series of lines. You can produce a very neat rendering of what the lines say word by word, and you won't have done the poem. You have somehow to learn how to inhabit the movement and the logic of the poem and follow that through, which means, in a way, you're writing a new poem in English. But in another way, of course, you're trying to be transparent to how the poem works in another language. And that's, that is complicated. That is complicated.
I mean, you're a native Welsh speaker, so is there a sense in which you're trying to bring the spirit of something intangible into the translated work?
You're always doing that as a translator. And the more you know a language, the more aware you are of what's not getting through.
Yes.
And that's just the way it is. And that's fine. You know, languages are, in various ways, quite rightly, quite properly impenetrable to one another. And that means you have to go on listening. Let's say, if somebody were to say, I'm going to translate Dante's Divine Comedy, or more recently, Czesław Miłosz's poetry from Polish, and somebody else said, oh, but there already is a translation of the Divine Comedy. or there already is a complete translation of Milosz's poems in English, that would be a bit crushing, wouldn't it? Because that would suggest that once you've got the equivalent, you didn't have to worry anymore. It's rather like saying, well, yes, by all means, put on another performance of King Lear, but it has been staged before. The inexhaustibility of this, of language to language, of person to person, I suppose if I have any kind of metaphysics, it's got a lot to do with that sense of the inexhaustibility in what we say and how we relate. And back to art and humanities again.
Indeed.
Everything to do with that.
So an opportunity to talk about your new book, Solidarity, an idea that really interests me. What drew you to this as an idea, and were there particular writers and thinkers that influenced you?
Oh, that's what the cover looks like. Very nice. Well, part of the book is about some of those writers, including the really, really fascinating Polish priest and philosopher Józef Tischner, who was, as it were, chaplain to the Solidarność movement in Poland in the early 80s, and who wrote some extraordinary stuff about the nature of solidarity. Two things particularly coming out in his work. One is, he says, the challenge is to find a solidarity without enemies. That is a sense of common purpose that doesn't depend on being able to say, and this is what sets us in opposition to them. How do you do that? Second thing is the way in which he links solidarity with what he calls faithfulness and labour. Solidarity has a lot to do with shared work, a sense that you are contributing to something which neither you nor the other person is completely in control of, but in working together, you discover new things in that process, and you discover a good, an aim, a project, a product that neither of you alone could produce. But for that to happen, you need to have fidelity, that is, you need to trust each other. So it's the experience of work that consolidates trust, and it's in that trustful working together that the deepest kinds of solidarity come up. So Tischner is full of brilliant one-liners of that sort. He's just bubbling over with ideas. And I discovered him almost by chance in a footnote in somebody else's book and thought, that sounds interesting, and started investigating a bit. So that's part of the book. Also looking at some other writers like Jan Patočka in what was Czechoslovakia, Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany, theologian, thinker, pastor, martyr. But I guess that a good deal of how the book works is, I realized as I began to write it that I was looking back on a cluster of bits of work I'd been doing that needed to be pulled together in this context. So I did some lectures in Harvard about 12 years ago on empathy as a notion in ethics and in psychology. I did some work, some other lectures abroad on human rights, and gradually came to see that the questions about solidarity, the questions about how we, hence the subtitle, how we recognize one another as agents we can respect and cooperate with, that had a lot to do with empathy, how that works, and that the notion of human rights depended ultimately on some vaguely defined but quite powerful awareness that, again back to our earlier conversation, no one's safe until everybody's safe. That human rights has something to do with recognizing that the other is part of my good and their good is part of mine part of theirs, and that the kind of siloed ethic which says the main thing is that my society should be first in the world, or that we look for world-beating achievement. I remember being really chilled in the pandemic when Boris Johnson was talking about world-beating British medical science, and thinking, why world-beating? Who says it's a competition?
But in a way, it gets to the nub of it, doesn't it? Perhaps you disagree, but solidarity is a quite unfashionable notion in an age of hyper-individualism. And people would argue that it involves abnegating perhaps a sense of self.
I think it involves a real transformation in the sense of self. And again, part of the book is about that. The chapter on empathy has quite a bit to say about how the very notion of a self is, in a way, a social construction, by which I don't mean, we take it from society or social norms, but that you can't construct an idea even of your own body unless you imagine the perspective of another. In very basic terms, I cannot see the back of my head. You have to do that for me. To form a notion of a human body and a human agent, you need something other than where you're sitting. So the very idea of a self demands that. And if we think we can construct a mythology of the self that absolves us from that, we are entering on, I think, a profoundly untruthful, destructive, we have entered upon a profoundly untruthful and destructive picture of what and who we are.
Do you see this as being an idea then that would be rejected by many on, I'm going to use the term right, but it's not particularly helpful necessarily in the current context?
Well, I shall wait and see with interest. The odd thing is, of course, that the language of solidarity historically has been both a left and right phenomenon. If you go back to Burkean conservatism, then the emphasis there, which I think is largely benign, the emphasis there on learning together, the emphasis on, if you like, natural affinity in a non-exclusive way, I think that's got a lot to do with what I'm trying to explore. Equally, the language of solidarity in those terms is often associated with the left, and particularly with the labour movement. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever. It's the union makes us strong, as some of us may have sung in earlier years.
Thinking then about, move on from your book, I look forward to reading it. What does Rowan Williams read for pleasure? What do you do to relax when it comes to reading?
Quite a lot of Golden Age detective stories, if I'm honest. But there are novelists I go back to. I'm one of those people who rereads enthusiastically. And I like to go back to read, among recent writers, A.S. Byatt, who's a great favourite in all kinds of ways.
Quite a daunting writer. Any recommendations for a beginner?
But so, I can only say so satisfying as a writer, by which I don't mean consoling, because she certainly isn't, but the sheer felt depth of her characterization, the density and detail of the prose, the construction of worlds, worlds of all kinds, imaginative worlds, literary worlds, not only brilliant pastiche, as in Possession, but also deeply three-dimensional evocations of something like the world of a new university in A Whistling Woman. So I just love reading Byatt. I like to reread Robertson Davies every few years, a Canadian novelist.
Whose family, I think, was originally from Wales.
Absolutely, yes. I met him once, and we exchanged a few words in Welsh. But yes, a complex figure again, and I don't always like either the Jungian subtext, rather uncritically used, or the sort of fogyish attitudes. But as an entertainer, pretty impressive. And the other writer I go back to often, and thinking of books that have impacted me, I think I'd put this quite high. I like Thornton Wilder, not the most fashionable of American writers now.
Our Town is seen as a kind of a dated play, but one which is performed regularly.
I went to see it at the Grand Theatre in Swansea a few weeks ago.
Yes.
With Michael Sheen in the main role, and we did it at school in the sixth form. But there's a novel by Wilder called The Ides of March, which he calls a fantasia on events in the last days of the Roman Republic. It's a novel about Caesar. Caesar and Catullus and Cleopatra and various other figures, and it's a novel mostly told in documents, letters, memos, public records. He messes around a great deal with the history of Julius Caesar's lifetime. The chronology is all over the place, and he admits it's a fantasia, it's not a historical novel. But what it does is, I think, to give you insight into two or three very, very central things. One is something to do with the nature of power. The Caesar of this book is a deeply self-aware, complicated personality who is coping with the fact that he is in a position where everybody trusts him in a way which he knows is dangerous. And he's pushing back against that projection all the time, and yet also sort of seduced by it. And Cleopatra's arrival in Rome, which of course did happen in the year of Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra's arrival in Rome slightly shifts the emotional balance, the perspectives of the book in the most fascinating way. The evocation of Cleopatra is beautifully done. This amazingly seductive and chillingly intelligent young woman. And there's a passage somewhere where Caesar is describing to a friend how, this is somebody who will sit on your lap and ask you questions about the gross national product of Cyprus. And then the other feature is Catullus, as I say, features in the book. And we meet him through his letters at various points, and we meet him also in an account of a dinner party where Caesar is present and Catullus is present. And Catullus begins to relate a story about how you recognize a god. And it's a very enigmatic and difficult section. And I think what it's talking about is the sacred is never just embodied in the world in obvious visible form. It's hidden. You need work. Again, work of recognition, sorry. And the climax of that beautiful chapter is Caesar is sort of passionately engaged with this and can't wait to find out where it's all going. And he gets up from the table to engage more fully with Catullus and collapses in an epileptic fit. So you never find the end of the story. But both for Catullus and for Caesar, it's a kind of transformational moment. So Catullus as artist is part of Caesar's answer to the question about power. Power, sorry, I'm sort of riffing slightly on the book now, but power always seduces you into thinking that there can be a simple answer, politically, ethically, whatever, because you're in charge, so you can make things happen. But what if power, ultimately divine power, really isn't like that? What if it's always enigmatic and requiring you to look round things and behind things and not think of it as something you have got to incarnate? And speaking as a theologian, of course, one of the things which is so extraordinary about our central story as Christians, about the incarnation, is that it's a story about divine power that refuses to disclose itself as divine. But I think there's two things in the Ides of March: Caesar reflecting on the nature of power, and the role of Catullus as representing through his art the life-giving mystery that Caesar needs to know. And then it all builds up, of course, to the eve of Caesar's assassination, and we all know what happens. But it's an amazing book. I love it.
Oh, you've sold it to me. One last question from me before I open it up to all of you, which is a fairly obvious one, which is, what are you reading now?
I think I mentioned when I had the question in advance two books that I was reading at that point,
Right.
which were David Bentley Hart's new theological book about the theology of Christ, one chapter of which is largely devoted to showing why I'm wrong on the subject. It's a very impressive book, very impressive book. And I was also reading a sort of ecclesiastical biography. But I feel I need to add a couple of other things.
Feel free.
Recently finished, belatedly, Andrew Miller's The Land in Winter.
Oh, I don't know that.
Which was a Booker shortlist recently, which I absolutely loved. And just today, on the train, I finished reading Ruth Padell's new poetry collection called Girl. It's wonderful.
You won't be surprised that Rowan Williams wasn't scrolling Instagram on the train. Not that I would ever do that. Rowan Williams, it is fascinating to have this conversation. I am now going to open it up to the floor. Obviously, this is a conversation about books, so it'd be lovely if we can keep it to books and questions rather than statements. Now, there is a microphone. There's a couple of microphones that are going to go. So should we start at the back and move forwards? So there's a gentleman just near you.
Lord Williams, I have a question to ask you about one of your books. When I was talking to you early on about my near-death experiences, I've been experiencing with my heart condition. Last year, I saw Jesus and the angels when I saw them in my near-death experiences. Can you explain to me why these things happen very briefly?
Oh, that's a big question, but thank you. There's a lot of debate about near-death experiences, isn't there, these days? And quite clearly, something extraordinary happens to our perception when we're on that edge. We see, experience, sense what we don't otherwise. And I wouldn't want to make too much of it in saying we see, what should I say? We see our final end or our final goal. I would say that it's a kind of reminder when we hear of those experiences of what around us we screen out so much of the time. Very often when people talk about angels in the tradition, it's among other things a way of saying we've trained ourselves not to see certain things. Our perceptions are narrowed, and in traumatic, extreme situations, that perception's opened up more fully, I think. That's just an immediate thought on that.
Okay. There's, go to the other side, yes. And I will promise I'll move forward.
Thank you. Since you mentioned Bentley Hart, I wonder what you made of his book, That All Shall Be Saved.
Oh, right, yes. For those who haven't read David Bentley Hart, American theologian, member of the Orthodox Church, very, very fluent, elegant writer in all sorts of ways. He wrote this book called That All Ought to Be Saved, arguing for universal salvation, that is, opposing any notion of an eternal hell, and got into terrible trouble with it in his own church and in some other contexts. What do I think of it? I'm not completely persuaded, not because I want to believe in hell, anything but I feel that you end up with a position as inflexibly dogmatic as the traditional one. It's as if David is saying, everybody's got to be saved. Everybody has got to be returned to the place where they came from, which is the mind of God. And I see where the metaphysical impulse comes from in that. I also think that it's just a bit of a shortcut. And for me, a work like C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce gives a much more credible picture of how we might start thinking about it. The Great Divorce being a work in which Lewis imagines hell and heaven in terms of hell as a place from which people are occasionally released on kind of yes, day release, to go and visit heaven. And you see, as this unfolds, how they can't cope with heaven. They're in hell because they have locked themselves up in various ways in their habits of thought and feeling. And you see with just one or two that they're beginning to open up to something a bit different as they visit heaven and think, actually, maybe. And there's a great deal then that sucks them back into the vortex of their own egos. Now, I find that more theological and pastorally helpful than just to say it's a kind of automatic process. So that's my slight quarrel with David, who thinks I'm probably an unhelpfully dogmatic traditionalist on this. Hope not, but, well, it's not over in this instance until the fat angel sings.
I think there's one on this side. You've got the microphone.
Oh, hello. This is a question about reading and writing and speaking. Through your work and your writing and readings, you must come across some very old, strange, mysterious, not to say weird, texts and some images. And I'm just wondering what your approach is for when you have a text like that, or actually even in your own mind, in the poet's mind, where you want to make that precise or bring some precision to all of this multi-layered mysteriousness for whatever purposes at that moment. What kind of approach would you take in doing that?
That's a very interesting question. I guess that when I'm teaching a text which is going to be strange for a contemporary audience or a contemporary student body or whatever, I want to, as I hinted earlier, I want to go back to the question, so what made it matter like this? Why did this come out like this? Can you at least begin to think yourself into the process by which this seemed to be a good outcome? So I'd want to do some quite close reading and say, look, don't be put off. Some of this will reek of an ancient or alien social and imaginative order. Okay, that's what it has in common with everything from its period. Now let's look at what this text says that isn't just what everybody else is saying. I find this especially important with teaching the text of somebody like St. Augustine. A lot of people still come to St. Augustine thinking, oh, St. Augustine invented original sin, hated women, thought sex was evil, and might just as well have invented the common cold. You know, he was responsible for everything that's wrong. So I want to go and say, let's read bit by bit. What's he saying? What's he afraid of? What does he want to say? What does he want not to say? And why does it matter? And, you know, go through as carefully as possible, so that at the end you might be able to say, well, Augustine says quite a lot of what his generation would say about women, for example. What does he say that isn't just commonplace in his own day? Because that's what kept the conversation going, the conversation that we are now inheriting and a part of.
Look for the original. So there's a question here, and there's a hand over there. We'll come to you next.
We are arguably, at the moment, governed by tyrants globally. Is this your book is a sort of voice in the wilderness against that, the venality and the evil of Epstein? I think that's a pre- and post-Epstein moment in terms of people supporting insurgent politics, turning against establishments. Is this, to return to books, a Gibbon, you mentioned the Ides of March, a Gibbon decline and fall of Western civilization as we know it at the moment?
I wish I knew the answer. I don't believe that there are determined patterns in history, but I think that historical education is an education in learning where and how to identify risk. We're at a deeply risky moment where the fragmentation of any sense of shared good or shared goals means that we may find ourselves condemned, as we see, as I speak, condemned to wars with no planned outcome, conflicts with no possible or imaginable resolution, and yes, something which is dismantling piece by piece any notion of an international order. So that worries me. And while I don't imagine for a moment that somebody in the White House will read my book and think, oh, how could we be so stupid? You do what you can, don't you? But I think it is a risky moment, a profoundly risky moment, because of this performative element in our politics at the moment. Statement, not strategy. We state where we are. We perform purportedly symbolic gestures to show our strength and our identity. And we don't ask, so what then? What then? We don't do end games, it seems. We got into the Iraq war that way, we're getting to other wars that way. What did Putin want in invading Ukraine? He wanted to invade Ukraine. And so on.
I'm going to take a question over there and a couple at the front here.
Thank you, Father. You gave quite a low-key endorsement of theology earlier when you described it, I think, as the afterglow that we're living in. I'm going to ask you if you'd like to put that endorsement a bit more strongly, even polemically. I mean, I'd put it to you that the humanities as a whole have been impoverished all the time, that we've made out, or many of us have made out, that human history is the totality, and that compared to the previous versions of the humanities, which were theologically inflected, the more recent versions have been weaker. Mm-hmm. And really, I'd like to think that you think that it's
always a good way of phrasing a question.
To try and make it a question, whether you think that for the humanities today to be, as it were, the chaplain for a new version of solidarity, theology needs to be reinstated, really, as something less peripheral and more central than it's been allowed to be recently.
Stick up for theology.
Stick up for theology. I'm very happy to stick up for theology. And I do believe that in the world of the humanities generally, this set of perspectives is a really essential resource. To put it, for the moment, no more strongly than that, an essential resource in keeping alive questions about human destiny, human identity, human dignity, which other disciplines do not and cannot ground in the same way. And that can be exhilarating, it can be critical, it can be difficult, and so it should be. But for theology to be part of that conversation, I would say is essential. And when I see universities like our neighbours in Cardiff cutting back on not only music, we were talking about that earlier, but also theology and religious studies, I think, what do they think the humanities are? How can you have a programme of the humanities that slices out this critical, generative, disturbing element in the spectrum of the humanities?
There's a question here.
Rowan, thank you so much. As always, with you, a tour de force. I wonder if you could comment on books, some of the major figures in the news currently. Aside from your book, which I'm sure will be excellent, Solidarity, are there any other books, maybe among the selection or maybe other books, you would recommend to, for example, President Trump, his wife, Melania, J.D. Vance, President Netanyahu,
Gosh, that's quite a...
and former Prince Andrew? And a final question, if I may, if you could comment briefly on the great Rabindranath Tagore, perhaps its relevance to your life and the life of potentially other people, please?
Okay.
Goodness. A reading list for all those folk. Just briefly on Tagore, while another bit of my mind copes with the reading list. Tagore, yes, I mean, extraordinary figure, partly because a living multicultural artist from an era before multiculturalism was popular. And I'm reliably told by people who know Bengali, as I don't, that the poetry we have in English is much less interesting than the poetry in Bengali. That's one thing. As for recommending books to Mr. and Mrs. Trump, well, maybe it's an evasive answer, but the best one I can think of immediately is the story about President Reith of Magdalen College in Oxford in the 19th century, when a young scholar came to visit this ancient, fabulously learned cleric and said, what should I be reading, Dr. Reith, to enhance my intellectual life? And the old man in his 90s then paused for a long time and said, "Young man, I would recommend you to begin by reading the Gospel according to St. Matthew." Pause. "And when you have finished the Gospel according to St. Matthew, I would recommend that you read the Gospel according to St. Mark. And when you have completed reading the Gospel," you can see where this is going. I wouldn't mind recommending President Trump reading the Gospel of St. Mark, and the others too, or anybody.
Rowan, each year for the last 9 years, I've heard you personally talk about your love of Shakespeare. And I'm wondering, tell the audience here how that has been so influential in affecting, and what you think of that. Is it resonance today? Thank you.
Thanks, John. Well, it'll be another evening at least, wouldn't it? I feel that the real Shakespeare discovery for me came, like many other literary discoveries, in the A-level period, when we were doing King Lear. And really going back to the secret garden, and this is bizarre, isn't it? What have the secret garden and King Lear got in common? Not lying about the depth of human self-deception, the possibilities for human violence, the apparent meaninglessness of everything on the table, and staring through it and saying, what if that's not everything? And I think in King Lear, Shakespeare is pushing you as far as you can go, remembering, you've heard me say this before, that King Lear started life before Shakespeare's time as a story with a happy ending. And Shakespeare extraordinarily decides, I'm going to wreck the happy ending, I'm going to kill them all. So when everything is really, really wonderful, and Lear and Cordelia have reconciled, then Shakespeare sort of switches the mood and kills them. As if he's saying to us, all right, so you've seen this reconciliation, you've seen the reality of forgiveness. How much difference does it make if this just fails? Is it still true or not? Now, Shakespeare's capacity to cut to that central question, what's true? What lasts? Let's complicate it as much as possible. Let's wind it as tight as we can. And then what? Does this love and forgiveness stuff still work? Over to you, audience, says Shakespeare. But he gives you that amazing resource in thinking it through. And I wouldn't have put it like that when I was doing A-levels, I suspect. But I think that's what it did for me. That's what it kind of planted.
Well, I'm sorry, that's all we've got time for. I know there are lots more questions. I apologise if I didn't get to you. But thank you so much, Lord Williams, Rowan Williams, for all that insight. I now have another mountain of books I want to read to add to the pile beside my bed already. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Lord Williams.